Great. I'll introduce myself and my co-presenter, Lucy. I'm Marissa Weiss, and I do science communication and science policy here at Harvard Forest in Petersham, Massachusetts. And Lucy is a GIS specialist who leads the NELF Explorer user support and also technical support for the tool. I'll be describing the RFP and taking questions about the RFP. And then Lucy is going to provide an overview of the tool, like an introduction to the tool, and there will be time for questions throughout the webinar. So the purpose of our webinar today is to talk about the New England Landscape Futures Explorer, or NELF Explorer, which is an interactive scenario-based land use mapping tool. NELF Explorer users can visualize different possible outcomes for the future of the land based on global trends and local decisions. So it's a tool to help you tell a story about the future of the land. On this webinar, we'll be going over the RFP, answering questions, providing a brief introduction to the NELF Explorer tool, and there will be additional time for asking questions about the tool itself. If you're not familiar with the NELF Explorer, we recommend the following steps. First, listen to this webinar, then open the tool on your own and browse around, starting with your hometown or start with a place that you care about. And then check out help.newenglandlandscapes.org for helpful information, including a video tutorial. And at any time, get in touch with us for more information or for training. So about this funding for the RFP, the funding source is the National Science Foundation, and the specific program is called Advancing Informal STEM Learning. This program supports science learning outside of the classroom, and goals of the program include developing new science learning opportunities and broadening access to science learning. So one specific way that that's been applied in this project was developing NELF Explorer, which makes land use modeling accessible via this online tool. And we can use some funding from this current grant to support participants who are using NELF Explorer. Participants are defined very, very broadly as people concerned about the future of the land in New England. So if you're concerned about the future of the land in New England, and if you're using NELF Explorer, then you're a participant. So next, I'm going to describe the proposal guidelines. Along the way, we're hoping that you'll keep in mind two key takeaways. One is that we're looking for creative applications of NELF Explorer, and we're particularly excited to hear about applications that we perhaps haven't even thought of. So think broadly and think creatively and try to surprise us. And second, the goal of this funding is to support your team to use NELF Explorer to do work that advances your mission. So we want this work, this funding to be useful to you and this project to be useful to you and your organization. So in broad strokes, projects must use NELF Explorer. Please be creative. Projects should develop an outreach project because this is a public engagement grant, and we're looking to make sure that the tool is useful, being used, and shared broadly. And share the outreach project with your network. The 4 project components are the project goal. Please tell us what your goal is. We expect that some goals might be planning, conservation, communications, but again, think broadly and creatively. The outreach product, peer-to-peer sharing in your network, and a final report. So document what you've done and send us the documentation. Again, we're looking for creativity. So some creative things that have come to mind for us include creating a video or an infographic or perhaps a poster or a pamphlet, or it could be a presentation. But there's really not Those are meant to not to constrain, but to inspire, and we're open to other ideas. In terms of the budget, this is a small grant of $6,000 per working group. We anticipate supporting 3 working groups. Ways in which this funding can be used include convening. So up to $6,000 of your budget can support meeting space, travel, lodging, and meals for people participating in your project. You could also support stipends within your budget. So up to half of your budget could go to stipends. And the maximum stipend per participant would be $1,000. The only condition of receiving a stipend is that anyone receiving a stipend will need to attend a virtual or in-person NELF Explorer training, which we will schedule with your team at the outset of the project. So we might be able to visit you in person, or else we will schedule a training via webinar. And then up to $500 of your budget can support the cost of your outreach product, such as printing or design costs for a poster or an infographic, or a videographer, or those sorts of things. A key thing about this funding is that it'll be administered by Harvard Forest. So we can't support overhead, and the way the funding will work is that we will pay the costs directly to vendors, or in the case of the stipend, we'll pay the cost directly to the stipend recipients, or we can reimburse you if you'd prefer to do it that way, but we won't advance the money. And if you have any questions about that, let me know, and I'm happy to discuss further. But a key thing is just that we won't support overhead, and the funding goes directly from Harvard Forest generally to the vendor or the recipient. So the deliverables for this project are a minimum of 1 product. So that would be perhaps a print document or a graphic or a video, that would your outreach project, documentation of your peer-to-peer sharing activities, and your final report. So document everything and tell us what you did. Oops, see, I have skipped. Okay, proposal instructions. This is a short proposal, 3 pages maximum, including the cover sheet and the budget. So the cover sheet includes your project title, your contact info, summary, timeline, and your budget. The main body of the proposal has your goals, activities, description of your outreach project, your peer-to-peer sharing plan, and your expected impact. And that's the whole thing. Submit your proposal as a PDF to me by email. And please remember to review the instructions to make sure you've covered all of the topics before sending it. And my contact information and Lucy's contact information is on the website, and certainly reach out to us with any questions. So the review criteria for the proposal are the reviewers will be me and Lucy, and also a NELF Explorer colleague here at Harvard Forest, and likely a NELF Explorer colleague at Highstead, a foundation based in Connecticut. And so it'll be a team of about 4 reviewers. We'll be looking for an important and timely application of NELF. We'll be looking for creativity, a creative outreach product. Feasibility, we'll be checking to make sure that NELF Explorer is a good match for the objective. We'll be looking to see if it seems like there's peer-to-peer sharing, a good peer-to-peer sharing plan, and that the budget reflects the work plan. So kind of a straightforward review plan. And the timeline is, the deadline for the solicitation for responding to this RFP is December 20th, 2019. Awards will be announced by mid-January with a project start date of February 1st, and we're looking at a project end date of the end of May of 2020. So I think that takes us through the overview of the program, and I'll open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please send us a chat, and also we can open up microphones if anyone would like to ask their question that way. So just pause for a minute and see if we have any questions. So we have a question. Can funds be used with peers in states that are outside but next to New England states? Funding can be used with peers. The use of the funds, you do not have to be within New England to receive funds, but you do need to be using NELF Explorer, which only covers the New England states. So being outside of New England wouldn't necessarily disqualify a participant, but it would just have to be clear how NELF Explorer was going to be used. If anyone else has any questions, we'll give another minute for folks to think of their questions, and then the next thing we will do is discuss, give an overview of NELF Explorer. Great, so I'm gonna pass the reins over to Lucy Lee, who will describe using the NELF Explorer. If you think of any questions at any time, feel free to chat to us, and also there will be time to ask questions at the end, and certainly submit any questions by email. So with that, here is Lucy Lee.
Great, thanks, Marissa. Yeah, and if you think of your question while I'm talking, please feel free to just send that through the chat, and we will answer it when we get to a pause. So I'm going to start. If you're not familiar with the NELF project, if you've never seen me, I'm usually the person that goes around to, and presents this to people. So if you've seen me before, this might be a little bit of a review, but hopefully it will still be useful. And so I'm going to introduce the scenarios themselves first, because whenever I start with the tool, the first question I get is, what are we looking at? So I'm going to start with more of the project background, and then we'll go into the tool and a live demo of the tool. And if there are questions about the project or the tool that arise, please also feel free to send those through the chat, in addition to questions about the RFP. So I'm going to go through some nuts and bolts of the modeling and the navigation of the tool. And to preface all that, I just thought we would list some ideas that are that the tool can possibly speak to, which includes many more things beyond land use, like uncertainty, things within and outside of our control, and the consequences of those things that happen to us, and the many future possibilities. It's kind of a fundamental idea of this project. Ecosystem services, particularly forest-based ecosystem services, are something the tool can speak to, but also ideas of the relationship between land use, resilience, and quality of life, sense of place, climate change, and we think there are many more themes that the NELF Explorer could be related to. So as we go through some of these specific details of the project, I hope you'll remember that, yeah, as Marissa said, we hope to inspire creativity rather than constrain people with these ideas, and encourage you to apply the NELF Explorer for your own things that you need in your work. All right, so the modeling, what actually are these scenarios? And the scenarios were built with stakeholders from across New England. There was one workshop in each state, and they went through a process that looked like this. They pictured New England 50 years from now and described how it was different and identified the drivers of change that led to those differences 50 years from now. They ranked the drivers by impact and uncertainty, with the highest impact and most uncertain drivers being ranked higher. And then they took the most impactful and most uncertain drivers and created a scenario matrix, which establishes like the logic for the scenarios and ensures that they'll all be different enough from each other because of the drivers that form the matrix. Then in each quadrant, this workshop participants developed a narrative for the scenario based on those two characteristics, but also involving other aspects of land use and in New England. And then the final step was to contrast their scenario that they came up with from recent trends. So by the scenario development workshop, the research team had already analyzed recent trends in land use in New England, and they were able to present that information to the workshop participants for their scenario development process to help them kind of contextualize their vision relative to, a business as usual scenario. And what the research team then did was combine the common elements of the state scenarios to form a set of regional scenarios. And the drivers of change across the region that people kept referring to were socioeconomic connectedness, which ranges from local to global, and natural resource planning and innovation, which goes from low to high. And around these two drivers, the New England scenarios were formed, again, based on the common elements from all the 6 states that the research team could tease apart. And so that what came out is connected communities, which is a scenario of local connectedness and high planning, go it alone, local connectedness and low planning, growing global connectedness and low planning, and Yankee cosmopolitan, global connectedness, high planning. So each of these scenarios is a story. It's a story that contains information on energy, like these two drivers, natural resource planning and innovation, and socioeconomic connectedness, but also social attitudes, development patterns, how we use energy, things like that. And a thing about these scenarios is that climate change exists in all of them, but the way that it impacts New England and how we respond is something that varies in all the scenarios. So to read more about the scenarios, like where can you actually read these stories? There's Voices from the Land, which has summaries in the form of like short paragraph narratives, and also comparison of the land use in that scenario in 2060 to recent trends in 2060, which is like the business as usual scenario for comparison, and also some summaries of bullet points within the scenario matrix. It also has quotes from workshop participants that you might find useful for your project, and illustrations, which these are the illustrations. They're also in Voices, and we can share those with people if you think that those would be something that could be useful for your proposal project. And then there are these longer narratives that are kind of more useful for putting yourself in that scenario world. They're like 800 words that cover more details than natural resource planning and innovation and socioeconomic connectedness. And these are found on the help website, and I think this presentation could also go up there too.
Yeah, we can post the presentation, and then you can just click right from the presentation to the website.
Mm-hmm. And we'll show you how to get to the help website from the tool in just a few minutes. But one thing to remember as you're familiarizing yourself with the scenarios is that there's different scales, right? Like you're probably not going to do a project for all of New England. You're probably going to do a project about your area, and the outcome for your area might be different for the whole region. And an example of this is Yankee cosmopolitan is a scenario where there's 40% more acres developed by 2060 compared to recent trends, but that's not distributed evenly across the 6 states. And in Maine, in this scenario, there's actually 10% fewer developed acres because most of the development is happening in Connecticut in the southern states. So that's an example of how there's some nuance to the narratives, and there's some exploration to do of your local area and the relationships between the region and states. And this link, NELF scenarios, that's where these links are, and probably, yeah, okay. So that's where most scenarios would end. They would just be stories. But the NELF scenarios, we went a step further to map them through land use. And we have the land uses that you can see in the NELF maps and in the NELF Explorer are high and low density development, unprotected forest, conserved forest, agriculture, other, which includes some wetlands and barren ground like quarries and water. So when you look at the NELF Explorer, these are the land uses that you will be able to see. And so if you remember back to the workshop process, the last thing that they did was compare their scenario to recent trends. And recent trends is kind of the underpinning of the whole, everything that you see in the NELF Explorer. And so recent trends is a scenario that is business as usual, and it's based on things that happened between 1990 and 2010. So that's the reference period for the NELF models. And what they did was they used remote sensing data and some conservation data to find out, to look at what land use change happened over those 20 years. They specifically looked at 13 kinds of transitions, low to high density development, unprotected forest to some kind of development or some kind of conservation or agriculture or the conversion of farmland into development. And so those are the changes that we looked for in the past, and those are the only kinds of changes that can happen in the NELF Explorer. So when you compare scenarios, there's no like turning of land into water, because that's not a transition that was modeled with these scenarios. It was just these ones shown here. So that gives you the rate of change, how much is turning from one land use to another. And then they also looked at where these changes are occurring. So they had a few driver variables, including distance to cities and development and roads, ownership, population density, slope, wetlands and non-wetlands. And so using this, they figured out what changed and where it was changing within these 32 subregions. And so this allows for sub-regional variation across New England so that, you know, there are multiple little recent trends models run based on where you are. And so then the recent trends scenario is just a continuation of those patterns into the year 2060. And that's all the recent trends scenario is. It's purely data driven. So we have a recent trend scenario going on the left here, and then we know that the workshop participants, they expressed how their scenario was different from recent trends. And so based on that and a series of follow-up webinars, they modified the recent trends model to produce the scenarios, and they can change things like the rate at which land is changing. So they could decrease or increase the rate at which we convert forest into farmland or forest to development. They can change the size or shape of patches. So for example, connected communities has a different shape of development that kind of looks more like smart growth, whereas growing global is a sprawling scenario. And then they can also increase the probability. So the probability that land use change will happen in a certain place, like the probability that we will develop near the coastline is reduced in connected communities in Yankee Cosmopolitan. And these are the kinds of modeling notes that you can find in the full-length narratives that we have posted to the website. And so all these different changes that they did to the model produce 5 divergent scenarios for New England, with recent trends in the middle as kind of the business as usual grounding scenario, and then the 4 alternatives that were defined with the help of stakeholders. And we've packaged all these maps into the NELF Explorer. So we're getting to the tool now. And I'm just gonna click through, summarize the main features, and then we'll just open up the tool to see those in action. So the main feature of the NELF Explorer is that the maps, of course, that cover all of New England, and there's a map for each decade from 2010 to 2060. So you can kind of travel through time in the scenarios and also through space. And it's based on a slider and swiping, which we'll see in just a moment. You can also view acres of land use in each scenario within areas such as states, counties, municipalities, watersheds, or core-based statistical areas, which are the unit that the modeling was done in. We have a spreadsheet that you can use with these acres that you see here. You can put it in the spreadsheet that we linked to, and it produces additional statistics. So other thing, it just basically crunches some additional numbers for you and produces more stats than you can get from the tool itself, including some fun things like converting, acres of change to ball fields, and some basic charts that you could then edit or use as is. And if you use this spreadsheet that we've made, you'll see that it's kind of framed to be used with recent trends data, but you can put any numbers that you want in the spreadsheet and it'll produce the same numbers for you. There's no rules. And then the last component, so there's maps, there's acres of land use, and then the final piece of the NELF Explorer is acres conserved or developed within areas that are basically proxies for ecosystem services. So like within Franklin County, we could look at prime farmlands or wetlands and how much forest is conserved or developed within those areas. And of course that lets us know, tells us something about the quality of the ecosystem services that those areas provide and how they might be affected by conservation or development. Okay, so we have a video. This video takes you to like a 4-minute walkthrough of the tool. So if you forget everything that I'm just said or I'm about to do, there is a video you can watch to remember that. So I'm just gonna open a web browser. Don't use Internet Explorer to use the NELF Explorer. That's not a supported web browser, but I can use anyone else and go to newenglandlandscapes.org. There's a few ways to engage with the tool, but I'm just gonna skip to the maps to show you the interface. So as I mentioned, it's based on sliding to compare it to two scenarios or one scenario at different times. It's totally up to you. I can set either scenario to whatever year I want. So you don't need to do 2060. I could choose 2040 if that's more relevant time scale for me. I can zoom around and swipe back and forth to show recent trends, connected communities, recent trends, connected communities. I can change the scenarios by going to this button, change scenarios, and choosing any one of these buttons for the left scenario and one of these buttons for the right scenario. So I'll change my left scenario to growing global and see the map changes. And now I'm comparing connected communities in 2040 to growing global in 2040. You can explore areas and choose any of these that we just saw listed. And then I can click one of those areas on the map. This will take you back to the New England scale, and we can see all of the watersheds on the map. And I can click one, and it brings up the charts where I get the acres of each land use in the growing global scenario and the connected communities scenario. And I can also look at the different impact areas that are proxies for ecosystem services. So for example, when it says that conserved forest land increases, we can look down here and see that, okay, it's comparing connected communities, which has almost 5,000 acres conserved, to growing global. So it's comparing the scenario on the right to the scenario on the left with this increase and decrease language. And there's information about the scenarios here, so you can read more about it. You can change the base map. Over here, some of the base maps have labels, which can be helpful if you're not super comfortable navigating around maps of this scale. It gives a little more context. And then importantly, the link to the help website is right here. So this question mark takes you to the help website where we have the request for proposals, where we have the stuff I was just talking about with the full-length narratives, publications, the help video, FAQ, all sorts of resources. So that's a good button to know about in the tool. But that's basically the NELF Explorer, maps, acres of land use, acres conserved or developed. Yeah, going forward in time and alternative futures for New England.
Thanks. So we wanted to leave some time for additional questions, either about NELF or about the RFP. So we will pause again and open the floor for discussion or questions. We're gonna look in the chat and see. I think, let's see.
Oh, someone raised their hand.
Oh, yes. Okay. We're gonna thank you for raising your hand. I'll unmute you. Unmute. Okay, Mary, I believe you can speak to us now. We cannot hear you. While we're working on Mary's volume, we have a question that in the chat that we'll talk about. So the question is it possible to change some variables or weights of the model? So not within the NELF Explorer, no. The data underlying the NELF Explorer are available via Databasin, and that's something you can email us about, and we can get you connected with the data, which you can use to the extent that you desire within GIS software. But within NELF Explorer itself, those things are fixed. Let's see.
What does lowering her hand do?
I think so. Mary, I'm sorry we can't hear you, but we do see your hand is raised. If you can chat us your question, that would be great. Let's see. Okay, question about the area. So can you say more about, so the tool covers all of New England. Maybe it'd be helpful if we go back over to the tool. And so, oops.
This is the slide.
Yeah, we're in the slide.
I might have closed it. Oh no, it's there.
But so the full extent of the tool is all of New England, and then within Explore areas. So basically, anywhere in New England, you could look at you could look by state or by county, and you can kind of select the smallest possible area. Maybe Lucy, you could speak to the range, like the smallest possible area versus the.
Yeah, so we typically advise people not to try to apply the tool at a scale smaller than the town, because one thing about the modeling is that there's some randomness in it, right? Like life is random, so there's some randomness in the model, and if we were to do this 50 times, we would get 50 slightly different models is a smaller 28 square. So I think we certainly, yeah, absolutely. We don't have any, if you think that it can work for you, then absolutely. The only limitation of the NELF Explorer is that it only has the one level of watershed. So the question is, sorry, I read it but didn't state it very clearly, is about if there's a watershed that's too small, or if it's eligible size. And I think the answer is yes, of course, it's definitely eligible. But we only have this one watershed option in the tool, which sounds like it might be a little bigger than the watershed you're thinking of. But if you have the capability to, use GIS with your watershed, then absolutely.
Yeah. Another way we've heard from people that they've been using the tool to some extent is by putting it in municipality mode and selecting a municipality that's potentially near that's kind of near their area of interest. And then you can sum the parameters. You could look at multiple municipalities, neighboring municipalities, and kind of sum the land use changes. So that would be another way to address an area that's smaller than the predefined watersheds. Would you like to talk about?
Sure. So another question is, how is population growth or decline a factor? So great question. How population growth or decline is modeled, it is present. So on the most basic level, connected communities and go it alone are the scenarios where there's kind of stable population, and Yankee cosmopolitan and growing global are the scenarios where there's population growth. And you can find this out from the scenario narratives, either in voices or the full length ones. And the population growth in Yankee cosmopolitan and growing global is mostly from the narratives due to climate change, migration, both international and domestic. But it's not, population growth isn't modeled, it's not like we took other people's models of where population is going to grow and incorporated that into our model. It's more of just a characteristic of the scenario, and that is then is modeled as land, or simulated as changes in land use. So there's no connection to other people's population projections or anything like that, but it is part of the storyline, if that makes sense. And if not, please feel free to tell me that it doesn't, and I'll try to keep explaining it.
So for example, we could do, we could just put this back to the state level for fewer lines. Like if we contrasted go it alone, which would be like a population reduction scenario, versus growing global, which would be a population growth scenario, then you would just see it play out. And then if we put our timeline all the way at 2060 for both scenarios, and I'll minimize the data window, then right now, so right now we're looking at go it alone on the whole map is go it alone, the population reduction, the population decline scenario. And I'll just zoom out a little bit so we can get more of New England. And then growing global, the population growth scenario is basically expressed via development or less development. So that's how it's factored in and how it plays out. So we're certainly happy to stay on the line and take any additional questions. I'll put back on the screen the link to the RFP. And certainly if you think of things after the webinar, after the conclusion of the webinar, send us an email anytime. If you'd like more training, if you'd like a workshop, please reach out to us. We're happy to meet with you further and discuss. We're also happy to discuss if you have some ideas or more specific questions that you'd like to ask us offline about your proposal or other applications of NELF. Certainly do reach out to us. Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and please keep in touch.
I like the exit setup. Showing.
Okay, we are now going to end the webinar.